First Kings chapter 4. This chapter covers Solomon's officials, how he divided his land up, and the provisions he acquired from the land. Verse 1. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel, and these were his chief officials: Azariah son of Zadok, the priest; Elhoreth and Ahijah son of Shisha, secretaries; Jehoshaphat son of Ahilud, the recorder; Benaiah son of Jehonidah, commander-in-chief of the military; Zadok and Abinather, priests; Azariah son of Nathan, in charge of the district officers; Zabud son of Nathan, a priest and personal advisor to the king; Ahizhar, in charge of the palace; Adoniram, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor. Solomon also had 12 district governors over all of Israel, who supplied provisions for the king and the king's household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month of the year. These are their names: Ben-Hur, in the hill country of Ephraim; Ben-Dekah, in Makaz Shalbim; Beth-Shamesh, and Elon Beth-Hananah; Ben-Hased, in Aruboth; Succoth, and all the land of Hepher were his; Ben-Abinadab, in Naphoth Dor. He was married to Taphath, daughter of Solomon; Bana son of Alhilud, in Tanash and Megiddo, and all of Bethshan next to Zarthan, below Jezreel, from Bethshan to Abel Meholath, across to Jokmi; Ben-Gibber, in Ramoth Gilead. The settlements of Jar son of Manasseh in Gilead were his, as well as the district of Argob in Bashan and its 60 large walled cities with bronze gates; Ahinadab son of Iddo, in Mahanaim; Ahimzah, in Naphtali. He was married to Basemoth, daughter of Solomon; Bana son of Hushai, in Asher and in Aloth; Jehoshaphat son of Paruah, in Issachar; Shimeah son of El, in Benjamin; Gibber son of Uri, in Gilead; the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the country of Og, king of Bashan. He was the only governor over the whole district. Most of the people in this list are relatively self-explanatory. We have sons of Zadok and all these other people who we know from different parts before. There are a couple interesting things. One, you'll notice there's a man in charge of forced labor. So Solomon obviously did force people, and we're going to see that later. He forces some people to work for him, and you don't have a choice. And this is the guy in charge of it in verse 6. Now, the interesting thing, though, really is in verse 7, where we talk about the 12 districts. Now, it's true that there were the 12 tribes, but these districts are not the same as the 12 tribes. Now, you'll notice that there are a few that are, like in verse 17, Jehoshaphat is in charge of Issachar, the entire area of Issachar. And Shimei, in verse 18, is in charge of Benjamin. But that's not the case for all of them. There are several places where what he's done is he has taken a region that is similar to what the original parcels of lands given out to the people were, and then he's added into that areas that his father David has conquered. And what this does is he's covering this entire area, and the power and the area that Israel rules has greatly expanded. And we'll talk about that in the next section. But each of these areas is often the area plus surrounding areas that have been added in by King David. One thing to note is that the the tribes of Manasseh and the tribes of Ephraim have been split up. Okay, now the reason this would happen is because King Solomon is trying to make sure that that old tribalism is broken down to some extent. Like some of the tribes he's not worried about, but some of the tribes, more powerful ones like Ephraim and Manasseh, he wanted to be sure to split them into smaller pieces so that they didn't have the same power that they did before. And you'll see that some of the areas are rather huge. And there's one spot that talks about 60 walled city with bronze gates. So what's important about that? Well, normally the gates would be made of normal wood, and the hinges would be made of something like, wood or something like that. Whereas to have a bronze gate, it's not the whole gate was made of bronze usually. It was a lot of the fasteners, the hinges were made, and all these extra things that maybe bronze banding on it and things like that. But to have them made or adorned of bronze showed the power of those cities. They were wealthy enough that they could have these high-class, very powerful gates. So some of these guys have been given massive areas to control. And we'll see why he does it, but primarily it looks like the reason he's broken it up into these is to make tax collection and to be able to control the people in these areas a little bit better. Because before this, it was just a little kingdom, and King David was very, everybody liked him, everybody kind of listened to him. But now you've got a real kingdom going on. And he's going to, in the next section, he's going to assign each of these guys, or in this section really, he's going to assign each of these guys with the responsibility to feed the entire palace, all of Solomon's court, for 1 month. Okay? And we're going to talk about those provisions in the next section. One thing to note as well is that Judah is not required to do this. So every other area is required to do this, but none of these areas actually cover Judah. And we'll see that Manasseh and Ephraim are split, and they're not, just like one person over it. You'll also notice that 2 of these guys are the sons-in-law of King Solomon. So I guess it does not hurt to be related to King Solomon to get in one of these positions. And these are very powerful positions because these are very important people. Okay, moving on. Verse 20. The people of Judah and the people of Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 kor, 6,600 liters, or about 185 bushels, fine flour, and 60 kor of meal, about 13,200 liters, or 370 bushels, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebuck, and choice fowl. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the river, from Tifsha to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. Solomon also had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. The district officers, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They also brought to the proper place their quota of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses. Okay, so when you look at this, this is kind of like the provisions list for King Solomon. And when you look at the provisions, you're going to see that most of these are provisions that we'll keep. What I mean by that, we're talking about grains, types of grain, and we're also talking about cattle. So the cattle, you would keep them alive, and you'd only slaughter them right before you needed them, because we don't have fridges back then. And the grain was something that you could store very easily. Now, a couple of things. First off, we're talking about as numerous as the sand. So that's an idiom that means it's just almost uncountable. Okay, they ate, drank, and were happy. All of this is showing this idealistic picture of King Solomon's kingdom, which was very powerful and very rich. And they lived all the way from the river. So whenever you see a reference to the river, and it doesn't say which river we're talking about, it's talking about the Euphrates River, because the Euphrates River is the greatest river in that area. And this is the largest the kingdom will ever get. It's all the way from the Euphrates River down to Egypt. And this is the area that was promised to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and in Joshua chapter 1. Now, before this, the people of Israel never had that big, and after this, they also never had it this big. But during King Solomon's time, they have reached the maximum size they will ever get. When you continue on, you'll see the provisions, like we talked about, and notice that he also has a lot of wild game. So not only do people have to raise some of these, some are special, some are stall-fed, some are pasture-fed. These are high-class animals, some of them. And then he also has deer, gazelles, all these things. And it talks about how peaceful it is. So it says from Dan to Beersheba. That is another way of saying from the top to the bottom. It would be like saying on a human, from their hair to their toes. So Dan to Beersheba, Dan being the largest city in the north of Israel and Beersheba being the largest in the south. Now, the funny thing is that at this time, the kingdom of Israel is actually much bigger than that. But this is just an idiom to say that the entire land was something. And here we're saying peaceful. Each man had his own vine and fig tree. Now, this is a way of emphasizing how peaceful it was. Vines and fig trees, they take a long time to grow and flower, and you need peace to be able to do this, because when things are at peace, you can build these things. And the idea is that each person has their own land, each person has their own place, and it's at peace because they were able to do this uninterrupted by wars or famines and other things. So it's showing just how great the kingdom was during Solomon's time. Next, we talk about the 4,000 stalls and 12,000 horses. Now, that sounds very odd. There might be a reason to this. Traditionally, each chariot team would have 3 horses, like 2 that were actually pulling the chariot and 1 that was kept in reserve. So if something happens to one of the horses, you have like a backup, like you'd have a spare tire. Now, in active battle, you don't take 3 in. You'd keep 1 and you'd send out 2. But that might be why there's only 4,000 stalls, because you'd keep the team stabled together so they could get used to each other. Then you have explaining why these officers were important, because each officer took care of all the people eating at the king's table. That means all the officials, also everybody around him. Moving on. Verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, a great breadth of understanding in a measureless amount, just as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was even wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Azarite, wiser than Herman, wiser than Calcon, wiser than Dardan, and the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by their kings of the world, who had heard about his wisdom. Okay, this section is talking about how great Solomon is. And it compares Solomon to the wisdom of different places, the wisdom of the East. Now, those were the people, which we get to the New Testament, we're going to talk about the wise men that came from the East. So, Persia and places like that, Persia, Babylon, and even further. Some people think this includes India and places like that. But Solomon was wiser than all of those people. The other thing to see is Solomon is even wiser than Egypt. And Egypt is considered as one of these very wise places that has hundreds and thousands of years of history written down, and people have writings and Solomon was greater than that. Then they start to name some people, Ethan and Hermon. And we know them. You might not know you know them, but if you look at Psalm 89, you'll see that that was written by Ethan. And Psalm 88 was written by Hermon. Some of the others we're not really sure about, but some of them are famous people from various parts in the Bible. So these are the list of some of the most great people, wise people that they knew. And King Solomon is wiser and greater than all of them. Now it says he spoke 3,000 proverbs. There's a difference of opinion on that. Some people believe that these were proverbs that he had created. So there were 3,000. Some people believe these were proverbs that he had memorized and he used when he was speaking. So could be either. His songs numbered 1,005. Some people believe this is an exact number. There are 1,005 songs that King Solomon composed. Others think that 1,005 is just a way of saying more than 1,000. So it might even be like 1,100, 1,200, but the idea is definitely 1,000, probably more. Okay, so Solomon was someone who wrote, who understood, who could teach things. You can see from all the subjects that he was a wise man, and he was a man that knew a great amount of knowledge, just understood things that nobody else did. So it makes sense that kings that heard about it would send their wise men to be trained by King Solomon. And now with Solomon's fame expanding, you can tell he's rich, he's famous, he's put in place a good set of laws from the previous chapter, and he's figured out how to divide and govern the area. So we're going to stop there for tonight.